Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this really important discussion on justice for Palestine, fighting racism, and defending the left. My name is Yasmin. I'm the co-president for welfare and campaigns at the SOAS Student Union. Over the last couple of years, we have seen unrelenting attacks on Palestine solidarity work, and considering that this Sunday is the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, it is timely that we are having this discussion to make it clear that on the left, we are uncompromising in our belief in a liberated Palestinian people and a free Palestine. Palestine and the question of international solidarity disrupts our national imagination because it unearths the violent legacies of British imperialism and sparks conversations about capitalism, race, and empire. It is in this context that we see the attacks on our civil liberties, such as the freedom of speech, expression, and the freedom to dissent, organize, and protest, whether through the Racist Prevent duty, the new Department of Education guidelines that posit critical race theory and anti-capitalist teaching as extreme political stances, or the attempts to impose the controversial IHRA definition and its illustrative examples. We must stand firm against any and all structures of oppression, discrimination, and bigotry. So without further ado, I am very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Ben Jamal, who is the director of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign.
Okay, thank you. Can I just check, because I'm having some slight technical difficulties, but I just want to check that everybody can hear me. If someone can just post, fantastic. So let me begin by saying thank you to Rob Ferguson for the work he did in putting together this event, and I am delighted to be speaking on such a panel. And as I think was just said, Sunday is the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, and to mark this, PSC tomorrow is holding a National Day of Action, on Sunday an international rally, and next Wednesday a virtual lobby of Parliament, and the details of all of those are on our website, but I believe and understand are also being posted in links into this meeting. Now, the Palestinian people need our solidarity more than ever. They are confronting at the moment an alliance between the United States and authoritarian Arab regimes which have sought, under the guise of Trump's so-called deal of the century, to eliminate the Palestinian cause entirely. And although Trump, of course, is gone, we would be naive to think that Joe Biden is going to row back on the core elements of that deal. In the midst of this process, as Israel proceeds apace with further annexation and colonization of Palestinian land, we are also confronting a global attack on the solidarity movement. And this project of delegitimization is founded upon an attempt to reframe the Palestine solidarity movement, to recast it as something fueled by hatred and by anti-Semitism. And this is achieved, of course, by a redefining of anti-Semitism, so it no longer means what we all know and understand it to mean, the hatred of the Jewish people as Jews, but instead is conflated with opposition to Zionism as a movement and a political ideology, and opposition to any narrative that accurately historicizes the Palestinian struggle, that identifies the ongoing Nakba as an act of colonization and ethnic cleansing, and that accurately describes the state that Israel has established since 1948 as a state practicing a system of apartheid. This project seeks to place a wedge between the Palestine solidarity movement and other progressive movements. It seeks to establish as a norm the phenomenon that is often described in the United States as PEP, P-E-P, progressive except for Palestine. And as well as leading to the direct intimidation and attempts to silence individuals and groups, including through the introduction of laws that seek to prescribe and even criminalize the movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, this process also seeks to create a chilling effect, to make people wary or fearful about speaking up, to make Palestine a toxic issue, a subject to be avoided. Now, I've been asked to give many times examples of such a process in action, and Let me give you this one. Some of you will be aware that about 2 years ago, Tower Hamlets Council in London banned a bike ride that was raising money for sick children in Gaza because council officials feared it might be anti-Semitic because of references on the organizer's website to ethnic cleansing in 1948 and to apartheid. Now, I was one of those who subsequently went to lobby the mayor of Tower Hamlets, and I will tell you what I told him face to face, that I am the grandson of a woman called Nazli Jamal and a man called Shukri Jamal. And in 1948, Shukri and Nazli, alongside more than 700,000 other Palestinians, were forced to flee from their home, in their case, in Jerusalem. And they were forced to flee from their home for one reason, and for one reason alone, because they were Palestinians and because Israel wanted to establish a state in which the majority of citizens would be Jewish and in which those citizens would enjoy privileged rights above non-Jewish citizens. Now, my grandparents were never allowed to return to their homeland. They died in exile. Now, if you want to tackle injustice, then you begin by describing injustice accurately. And I am obliged to describe that history as an act of ethnic cleansing. But an official in Tower Hamlets sought reasons to ban that bike ride because they thought that such descriptions might perhaps be anti-Semitic, in accordance with the definition of anti-Semitism, the IHRA definition that the council had passed. Now, when these attacks on Palestine solidarity become conflated with broader attacks on the left, as happened obviously within the Labour Party after the election of Jeremy Corbyn, then one of the consequences which we have to resist is a move to sideline the issue of Palestine and other so-called contentious international causes such as Kashmir, in order, we are told, to protect a domestic socialist agenda. And we've seen this dynamic in a slightly different frame in the resistance within some arenas of the anti-racist movement to the framing of Palestine as a core anti-racist issue, as opposed to an issue of military occupation, because some are fearful of creating fractures in a coordinated anti-racist and anti-fascist alliance. We have to resist these processes by a reassertion of the interconnectedness of all struggles against different forms of unjust power, and linked to this, and fundamentally, a reassertion of the fact that there is no coherent anti-racist politics that does not address the world's most egregious example of institutionalized state racism manifesting itself in a system of apartheid. The road to a new Jerusalem, of a non-racist future, if you like, cannot take a bypass around the old Jerusalem. So in conclusion, these are the core tasks that we have to undertake. We need to challenge all attempts to close down the space and deny the rights to bring the facts of Palestinian oppression into the public domain and to call for action to address it. We need to understand and clearly frame the Palestinian struggle as a struggle against the imposition of racist structures of power. And we have to unify around the core values that underpin internationalism and a true anti-racist politics. Now, our day of action tomorrow, which clearly calls for an end to apartheid, for the imposition of sanctions by the UK government, and for divestment by public bodies in the UK from all complicit companies, is supported by all trade unions affiliated to PSC. It builds upon the motion passed by the Trade Union Congress this summer, which for the first time saw the trade union movement in the UK clearly naming the system of apartheid that is being imposed on the Palestinian people. As we approach the Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, we reassert the principles that lie at the heart of solidarity and internationalism, the principles once voiced eloquently by Nelson Mandela when he reminded us that all of our struggles against injustice, all of our struggles for freedom, all of our struggles for equality are incomplete without those rights being enjoyed by the people of Palestine.
Thank you, Ben, for these thoughtful remarks that remind us how this politics affects the everyday lives of Palestinians. I just wanted to take a moment to remind everyone again that Palestine Solidarity Campaign have organised a National Day of Action for Palestine tomorrow, and that there will also be an online rally taking place this Sunday from 5 to 7 p.m. You can also see all these details linked in the comments. A link has also been posted to a statement which over 400 students in the UK have signed that expresses concerns about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and its examples. I'm also very pleased to announce that there are over 500 people watching. So we're all in one big virtual room bringing us together. Please share the stream so more people can join this really important conversation. And next up, I am very proud to introduce Salma Yaqoob from the Stop the War Coalition, who is also an anti-racist campaigner.
I think it's absolutely vital at this time that we have such solidarity meetings, because of course there is an assault on the freedom of speech, on the freedom of action when it comes to solidarity with Palestinian people. And so this has not just come out of nowhere. At the moment, we're hearing day after day the latest episode unfurling around the Labour left, with what we've seen as a suspension of Jeremy Corbyn as a symbol of how they want to destroy any idea of Palestinian solidarity. Because of course, Jeremy's biggest crime is that he didn't stop standing in solidarity with Palestinian people and refused to apologise to do so. And what I want to focus on in my few minutes is to give a bit of an overview as to how this is not just about the Labour left. This is about an assault on all progressive movements, anybody who says that we stand in solidarity with Palestinians and acknowledges the oppression that is taking place there. Because the aim of this assault on freedom of speech is to limit the space for that. And I'm going to give a bit of good news and the bad news, because I think there'll be very few people on this call who are not aware about the oppression of Palestinian people and the fact there is this effort to silence critiques. But I see it almost as a sign of the success in the West of solidarity movements like Palestine Solidarity Campaign, like the anti-war movement, like many, many grassroots organisations up and down this country, across Europe, and indeed in America, where the battle for public opinion actually has been won over. And I trace this back to the early days of the anti-war movement around 2002, 2003, when millions of people mobilised against the war in Iraq, but at the same time made the links with neo-colonialism, imperialism, and what had been happening to the Palestinians since 1917. And when that consciousness was raised and people made those links, that set off a chain of reactions within the elites and within Israel itself. And there has since then, because, in a way, like I said, a backhanded compliment to the solidarity movement, to the fact that we had Muslims, left-wing people, and Greens, environmentalists, right across the political spectrum to the right in the name of humanity, saying we don't want Iraq to be bombed in our name. We know this is about oil, we know this is about power, we know this is about the strategic remapping of the Middle East. And actually we know that there is a history of this and that Israel has been a colonialist endeavour. And when those links were made, then the people who were losing the argument felt that then they need to resort to lawfare. They need to resort to using the instruments which the elites have access to, because they're losing the arguments when it comes to grassroots voices. And hence, it was no surprise to me that when the war on terror was announced, Muslims were on the front line of that. So whilst innocent Muslims abroad were being killed, murdered, tortured, lands being taken, those of us who happen to be born in the West, consider ourselves Western, I'm British, my children are British, were suddenly the fifth element, the fifth column in our own country. We were under suspicion. And there was a wholehearted attempt to take away the element of solidarity of Muslims for other Muslims around the world, to get involved in political engagement, no matter how peaceful, suddenly we're a threat. As it wasn't surprising that, for example, when the Prevent agenda was introduced, signs of extremism actually extended to becoming politically engaged. So on the one hand, Muslims were told, you need to understand about democracy and participate, but actually, if you do, you're going to get under the radar of security services and be seen as a threat. So I would argue that what a lot of progressive movements are experiencing is what Muslims in the West began to experience going back almost 20 years. So that's why I'm going back to this kind of historical lesson, that demonization, that othering, that being seen as a danger and to be isolated and marginalized. And actually it's because they were scared of solidarity. I very much believe that is the case. And we've seen in France an extreme example of this, where they have this term, Islamagauche, the Islamic Left Alliance, referred to in sinister terms, whereas here would say, well, isn't that great community cohesion? On the one hand, Muslims are told you're too isolationist, you guys stick to yourselves, but when we join in huge mobilizations for democracy, we're told that we're not supposed to be doing that. And some things that we have taken for granted, the freedom of speech in this country, never mind us now fighting for new rights, we're having to fight to stand still. So the fact that Black Lives Matter came under attack and have been labelled anti-Semitic, the fact that Trump's administration has labelled organisations like Amnesty International, Oxfam as anti-Semitic, these are all part of a bigger pattern. So we need to wake up. We need to be able to call it out for what it is. Denying the problem isn't going to make it go away. To take the argument this is genuinely about anti-Jewish prejudice and take it on face value at that level, and to deny the fact there is a political orchestrated attempt to minimize solidarity with the Palestinian people, will only lead to further and further retreats. And we've seen the chilling effect already. The fact that Gavin Williamson, in the middle of this epidemic, can prioritise telling British universities that their funding will be cut if they don't sign up to IHRA definition, tells me something very, very sinister is afoot. But again, the good news always is in our solidarity, and that's why meetings like this are important. It's important to keep talking about the plight of the Palestinians, to show them solidarity, to not allow our voices to be silenced, to not be intimidated. I know it's real, I know it's scary, I know people's livelihoods are on the line, but the more of us who stand up, who speak up, who call it out for what it is, we're in Emperor's New Clothes territory. You speak the truth, and actually the truth is far more clear, straightforward and obvious than the convoluted arguments that people are being subjected to, that all of a sudden we have all these left-wing racists who spent all their lives fighting racism and now being labelled as racist. So I welcome this rally. I'd urge people listening, watching, don't give up, just as the Palestinians have not given up. We are now having to fight for our rights in this country to speak up, but in doing so, we will be protecting those of the future generation. I'll end on this. The hope for me is this. The fact is, those under 35, the vast majority are on our side. They are activists for climate change agreements. They are anti-war. They get the fact that Palestinians are being oppressed. So we just have to hold our ground, be able to tell the truth. And I believe that demographics will itself be a huge force and a weight in our favour. So whilst it seems that we're under the cosh, and yes, those in power, those elites have those instruments, we just need to keep fighting, stand up, speak up. Thank you.
Thank you, Salma, for such a powerful contribution. I think it reminds us of our collective history of organising. That is the history that reminds us the importance of community and solidarity and the basic human values of collective care and love. We're not the first people to be doing this work, and we're definitely not going to be the last people. So without further ado, our third speaker is Alan Gibbons, who is the Secretary of Liverpool Walton CLP, and they're speaking in their personal capacity. Welcome, Alan.
Thanks very much, Yasmin. I think it's become a platitude to say that Jeremy Corbyn didn't come under the most systematic campaign of denigration I can remember because of what he represented as an individual. It was because of the potential of the movement behind him as a transformative socialist force for good and a threat to the ruling class, to the priorities of neoliberalism, to the demand that the poorest in society pay the cost of economic and political crises. And of course, the other part of Jeremy's appeal is that he's an internationalist and a lifelong supporter of justice for the Palestinian people, solidarity with liberation movements all over the world, especially South Africa and Latin America, and an anti-war campaigner. We all remember the time when we marched in our hundreds of thousands, our millions, against the Iraq war. And Jeremy's example encouraged CLPs like ours to pass motions against the shootings at the Gaza frontier. It encouraged us to affiliate to Jewish Voice for Labour. So you had a real platform of diversity of opinion about the issues affecting the Jewish community. It permitted the mass flying of Palestinian flags on the floor at Labour conference. But if there was a culture developed, a culture of resistance around the figure and the voice of Jeremy Corbyn, then there was a counterculture demanding that Corbyn be destroyed as a man and the movement around him be destroyed as an idea. The 2019 election defeat and Keir Starmer's leadership victory have together ushered in a sustained and mendacious political attack on the left. In Liverpool Walton, with the UK's safest seat, we backed the Corbyn project to the hilt. And that project is called socialism and internationalism. And now, to be honest, we're in the fight of our lives. We've seen the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn, the removal of the whip. We've seen restrictions on young Labour's right to voice an opinion. We've seen the blocking of the Fire Brigade Union access to the chair of the NEC. We've seen suspension of CLP officers in places like Bristol West, where they had the guts and the consistency to stand up and demand that this victimisation of Jeremy Corbyn ended. We've seen the investigation of Gemma Bolton, a new member of the NEC, of Arabic descent, for what a UN committee and Nelson Mandela had both said previously. This is the impact on free speech in our movement. The latest email to regional offices scandalously implies that the very act of showing solidarity with Jeremy Corbyn somehow makes CLPs unsafe places for Jewish members. Does that make them unsafe places for Jewish members moving the motions? Is there a single monolithic viewpoint held by a homogenous community? These are the questions that we have to ask. And we haven't taken it down lightly. In response, dozens of CLPs are putting motions in defiance of the warnings by the General Secretary. Some 10,000 emails have dropped into Starmer's and Rayner's CLP inboxes organised by Momentum. There have been petitions. There was an NEC walkout against the blocking of the Fire Brigade Union accessing the chair of the NEC. 7 unions have approached Starmer, and there's been an excellent CWU motion just this week. Tomorrow at 5 o'clock, there's a rally involving Socialist Campaign Group MPs. So there is a counter movement to the attempts to silence us. And it's not just the suppression of free speech from above that matters. If we swerve defence of Corbyn, if we fall silent on the injustices facing the Palestinian people, what is left of our socialism? And that leads me to a real source of irritation. Why am I, an elected officer of the Labour Party in my CLP, supposed to meekly accept the injunctions of an appointed General Secretary serving a probationary period? Why am I being told in emails that I've got to be the passive conduit of the opinions of the leadership? That is not what the members in Liverpool Walton elected me for, to be obedient and to put the views of somebody else. It was to be a champion of their ideas, a representative of their hopes and aspirations, of their solidarity with peoples in other countries fighting struggles like ours against oppression and racism and imperialism and war. And the last thing I want to say in this introduction is there is nothing more pernicious, degrading and will-sapping than self-censorship. As Bob Crow said, if you fight, you might not win, but if you don't fight, you'll always lose. To party members across the country, I'd say this: you can't just sit there and go all teary-eyed about Tom Joad's speech in front of the television on a Sunday and then gag yourself at the CLP the following Monday. There are a range of motions that you can use in your CLP, either calling for Jeremy's reinstatement as far as demanding the right to self-expression in your CLP. Please do what you can in your CLP to stand up to this suppression of our right to free speech in the Labour movement. And that leads me to a final piece of advice to close. You can't shout, "I'm Spartacus," and then add at the end, "unless the Romans rule my rebellion out of order." We have to stand up. We have to speak. We stand on the shoulders of giants who did that, and it would besmirch their memory if we fall silent. Solidarity, comrades.
Thank you so much, Alan, for your insightful comments. They show us how much of a threat an international socialist movement is to the ruling establishment. And it actually reminded me of Audre Lorde's famous words, "Your silence won't protect you. So we will not be silenced because there is no safety unless we make it." I am now very pleased to introduce Leah Levane, who is the Labour Councillor and co-chair of Jewish Voice for Labour, and they're speaking in their personal capacity.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. I've got 6 minutes, so I'm actually going to read what I've written. But I can follow on from Alan and say that last night my Labour Party also passed a motion supporting Jeremy Corbyn's reinstatement. So as a Labour Party member and as co-chair of Jewish Voice for Labour and as an activist for Palestinian rights, I'm always heartened by party members' support for Palestine. As Ben has said, the issue of justice for Palestinians is part of a broader commitment to equality, justice and human rights. Israel claims to act in the name of all Jews, but it does not act for me and many others of us. Its discriminatory laws, the ongoing and brutal military occupation, the lengthy siege is obviously experienced by Palestinians as racism. So it is clearly part of broader anti-racist struggles. Why, under the IHRA non-definition, should Palestinians not be allowed to say that? Why can't Palestinian Labour Party members get in their letters written about this published in Labour Party spaces? And standing up for Palestinian rights should not be linked to anti-Semitism. These issues are separate. I'm happy to talk about anti-Semitism, the importance of fighting anti-Semitism as one part of the broader anti-racist struggle. And yes, before I get misquoted, there are those, often from ignorance and sometimes from malice, who conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, or who conflate Israel and Jews. And egregious examples exist. I've seen some myself. And we must obviously address this constantly, sometimes through discussion and education, and yes, sometimes through disciplinary action. But to imply that the Labour Party is, and the left in general, is rife with anti-Semitism is ludicrous. It is evidence-free. Meanwhile, of course, we at JVL have been rather occupied with responding to the AHRC report into anti-Semitism, or more precisely, into the Labour Party's handling of complaints of anti-Semitism. I don't want to spend much time on that here. Suffice it to say, it is a deeply flawed document from its original terms of reference to its conclusions, to say nothing of the inflated response from the press and the Labour leadership. If you are so inclined, check out our website. We have a plethora of short articles, and next week we'll have a more detailed one, including addressing legal issues. But in terms of fighting racism, let us just note how much this EHRC report has been covered compared with that given to recent reports on racism towards Black and Asian people. I leave you to consider what impact this has on fighting racism, on solidarity and deeper understanding of the way that systemic racism occurs in our society. Firstly, Keir Starmer himself commissioned Doreen Lawrence to look into COVID's disproportionate impact on Black and Asian communities. And her report, An Avoidable Crisis, with a chapter on systemic racism, was launched less than 48 hours before the EHRC report, by which it was totally eclipsed. Secondly, on the 11th of November, a parliamentary report, Black People, Racism and Human Rights, was published with the starkest of conclusions that Black people's human rights were not protected in the United Kingdom. Also, virtually ignored. And meanwhile, stories of Labour anti-Semitism dominate, despite no evidence of Jewish people's rights being denied, of political underrepresentation, for example, and nor did the EHRC find any such thing. Most journalists and columnists simply report that their narrative of the last 5 years has been proved correct. It has not been. And something is seriously wrong when people like John McDonnell continue to ask Jeremy to apologise again and again and keep apologizing. We have never seen appeasement work. It has pushed things, made it harder for us all to fight generally. The same man, this is John McDonnell, who said when Jeremy was elected in 2015 that there will be violent or vicious, not violent, but vicious attacks on Jeremy's leadership. And we do not know where it will come from, but we need to be ready. Well, the attacks came and no one was ready. Jewish Voice for Labour didn't exist at the time. We didn't think it would be necessary. And more, just as a, one of the many wicked aspects of this whole palaver has been the whipping up of genuine fear of many Jewish people. Understandable fears, the prejudice about Jews could morph back into state-sanctioned discrimination, quotas, exclusions, and even pogroms and murder. Many of us will know of Jewish people who survived the Nazis and despite apparently living fully integrated lives in Britain, kept a packed suitcase ready to flee should the time come. Meanwhile, we've heard barely a whisper of the rising anti-Semitism and the rising white supremacy from the far right, including governments sometimes, all while the Board of Deputies of some Jews welcomes the likes of Trump and Johnson, presumably because of their uncritical support for Israel. And what terrifies, I think this is what points what Salma and Yasmin were making, what terrifies the ruling class is not Corbyn. Not only because of his support for Palestine, but the hope that he exemplified that it was possible for things to be different, that actually there is an alternative. So they're trying to put us back into a box marked resignation, but most of us live from a stance that another world is possible. And JBL takes our inspiration from past struggles, from heroes such as Ronnie Kasrils, who's faced far more risk speaking out than we do, and from movements such as Black Lives Matter, which has already been mentioned. You make the solidarity connections with Palestine and you call out the inequities inherent in capitalism. So how do we defend the left? We don't give up. It's not called a struggle for nothing. And our slogan is always with the oppressed, never with the oppressor. And it's from Marek Edelman, one of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising leaders. We are not facing guns and tanks or even imprisonment. So we have no excuse to be silent about racism, injustice, and equality, nor to be silent about the truth, however much we might seem to be living in some Orwellian nightmare. So we promise to keep our voices raised and to elevate the voices of Black, Asian, and Palestinian people. None of us must be silenced. Solidarity forever. Sumud.
Thank you so much, Leah, for such an honest contribution. That was really beautiful to listen to. Also, because we have been mentioning Black Lives Matter a couple of times, I just wanted to alert people that the government are shamelessly planning to deport up to 20 people to Jamaica on the 2nd of December, just before Christmas, and that if this plane leaves, more than 30 British children will suffer the experience of being separated from their fathers. There's a link that will be added to the comments now. It includes a petition, it includes an email template you can use to send to your MP, and keep an eye out on Twitter, on social media in general, for some more actions that will be coming up on the 2nd of December. It's really important that we resist violent borders and stand up to the racist, hostile environment policy. I'm now very happy to be introducing a fellow student, Layla, Assam. I hope I didn't mispronounce your name. They're the president of the Bristol University Palestine Society.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to go straight in with it. I'm a Palestinian anti-racist, anti-fascist activist, and I do think that in all of these conversations, we need to keep Palestinians like me and like Palestinians on the ground at the forefront of all of these conversations. However, I think to start with, we need to recognize the roots of how the issue of silencing is coming about and why. Now, anti-Semitism is on the rise again, and it's a racist poison in this world that we as anti-racists have to continuously fight in a united way. But anti-Zionism, that is criticizing the state of Israel and its oppressive actions, is not anti-Semitic. Zionism as a political ideology requires the systematic displacement of Palestinians. This makes it inherently violent and racist, as confirmed by the United Nations resolution in 1975. It is first and foremost a settler colonial movement. Now, conflating the two is dangerous, not only for Palestinians, in silencing our oppression, but it takes away from the real anti-Semitism that is on the rise. It takes away from that fight that we need to be, fighting wholeheartedly. So it's very dangerous to conflate the two. Now, Palestinian dispossession and occupation completely by Zion. Zionism has meant profound trauma for generations, systematically separating Palestinians from their homes, from their land, and from each other. Zionism in practice has resulted in massacres of Palestinian people, ancient villages and groves of olive groves completely destroyed, families who live just a mile away from each other separated by checkpoints and by walls, and children holding on to the keys of their homes in which their grandparents were forcibly exiled. The question has to be raised of why do they want to silence us? Why are they using anti-Semitism as a means of silencing criticisms of Israel? And the answer is that, the pro-Israel lobby is a massive one. And that is because the atrocities committed in Palestine are so awful. This is the reason that this silencing is occurring. Just to go back, to go into that a bit more, Israel was created in 1948, a complete catastrophe, resulting in 850,000 Palestinians forced out of their homes. They massacred entire villages of people. They invaded homes that were still fully furnished and occupied them. Children were separated from their mothers. So many people were killed. And since then, they have been running an apartheid regime, an illegal occupation in the West Bank, a complete siege on Gaza, which is the largest open-air prison in the world. And the human rights crimes of the state of Israel, such as child imprisonment, torture, house demolitions, just to name a few, are immense. The occupation restricts freedom of movement, restricts families from seeing one another, from going to work. They require Palestinians to go on Arab-only roads and Israelis and Israeli settlers on another, and they can travel freely. Settlements continue to be built on stolen land, making Palestinians homeless. Olive groves continue to be burned, and annexation is posing a huge threat to our existence as a race of people. So on that, I just want to say that the language that we use when we talk about Palestine is very important. This is not a conflict. This is not a war. This is the oppressor and the oppressed. This is racism, this is colonization, and this is apartheid. Now, Israel carries out lots of acts that are prohibited by the UN Apartheid Convention, including, just to name a few, the forcible transfer of Palestinians to make way for illegal Israeli settlements, preventing Palestinians from returning to their homes and their lands, systemic and severe deprivation of fundamental human rights of Palestinians based on our identity, denying Palestinians the right to freedom of movement and residence, and murder and torture and unlawful imprisonment and other severe deprivation of physical liberty, especially of Palestinians living in Gaza, and persecution of Palestinians because of their opposition to apartheid. It's very important, I think, to look at the parallels between the apartheid state of Israel and the apartheid state in South Africa. Now, to exist as a Palestinian left-wing activist right now in a political climate where it's becoming more and more apparent that you cannot be outspoken about our oppression is a catastrophe in itself. It's completely demoralizing and very destructive. And I just want to say that the witch hunt on Corbyn has resulted in those in the left who do speak out to be silenced, and the Labour right is only accelerating this. And we cannot compromise on Palestinian rights. We have been ignored and we have been oppressed for so long. And now, in a time where the government are trying to make working class people pay for a pandemic, where the far right are again on the rise and racism is rampant systemically and in all aspects of society, we need to unite. I think Keir Starmer's Labour is proving that you cannot be pro-Palestinian in his party. And I think wherever you are on the left, my last message, as a Palestinian activist, I'm a socialist, I'm part of the Socialist Workers' Party, but wherever you are, if you're in Labour, you're not part of an organization, we need to unite. We need this united front. We need to fight all oppressive systems. We need to fight all oppressors. And for Palestinians coming from one, this united front is completely vital for the liberation of all oppressed people. We cannot be silenced any longer. So thank you for having me, and solidarity to everyone, and solidarity to my people in Palestine.
Oh, I'm very sorry about that. I know there were audio issues. I just wanted to say thank you so much, Layla, for those valuable comments. This is a good opportunity to plug the actions planned for this weekend by the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And I just wanted to remind any students watching to add their name to the list of over 400 students that have already signed a statement expressing concerns about the government's latest move to try and force universities to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism by threatening the cutting of funding streams. All of those details will be found in the comments. And I'm really pleased to announce that we have over 550 people watching. So please keep sharing the links to the Facebook and YouTube live streams. And without further ado, we now have our next speaker, Louise Regan, who is the National Officer at the National Education Union, speaking in their personal capacity.
Hi, Yasmin and everyone, and thank you very much. And thanks to Rob and all the organisers for setting this up. There have been some absolutely amazing speeches so far. I want to, as been said, I'm a national officer from the National Education Union, and I want to talk mainly about the importance of trade union involvement in the Palestine Solidarity movement. However, I just want to make a couple of comments as a teacher. I've been teaching for over 30 years. And I just want to say that children are not born racist. Racism is something that is learned, that is taught. And our job as educators is to ensure that our education system teaches an anti-racist and an anti-colonial curriculum. And I'm really pleased that my union is absolutely committed to that agenda and to promoting that and to ensuring that that is something that we push to be embedded across the curriculum. Because we think that that is really important. And I'm also very pleased to say that my union was one of few that spoke out so vocally about the Prevent agenda that Salma referred to earlier, which I think is something which is truly a shameful programme, and we should have had much more trade union action against. So back to the trade union movement. The trade union movement in the UK is made up of around 5.5 million members. That's quite a big voice, I think. And trade unions are all a major part of the Palestinian solidarity movement here in the UK. All the major trade unions are affiliated to Palestine Solidarity Campaign nationally, and lots of them do a huge amount of work either linking up with trade unions in Palestine, but also sending out delegations and talking to people about the situation out there. And they are also at the heart, obviously, of fighting racism and all oppression in our society. That is what the trade union movement is based upon. My own trade union, the National Education Union, and what was priorly the National Union of Teachers, has been actively campaigning for justice for the Palestinians since the 1980s. And in recent years, we have taken 2 delegations a year to visit schools as educators, but also to meet with activists in Israel and Palestine who are campaigning against the occupation there. This year, and this isn't the first motion that has gone through the TUC Congress, but this year there was a motion to the TUC Congress, which Jamal referred to earlier, around the situation in Palestine. It was submitted by Unite, and Simon Gibbons is the trade union liaison officer for Palestine Solidarity Campaign, but obviously works for Unite, submitted that motion, but it was supported widely by trade unions across the Congress. And it called for the Congress to do a number of things which I think are really important. So I'm going to read out what the actions were, because I think that they are important words. At the moment, they're only words, but what we do need to do is make sure that the trade union movement takes up these actions. They called for the Congress to fully support and play an active role in the Palestine Solidarity Campaign's actions, to build a broad coalition against the proposed Israeli annexation, and to urge all of the TUC affiliates to do likewise. The second thing it called for was for the TUC to send a letter to the Prime Minister demanding that the UK take firm and decisive measures, including sanctions, to ensure that Israel stops or reverses the illegal annexation, ends the occupation of the West Bank and blockade of Gaza, and respects the right of Palestinian refugees to return. And the third thing it called for was that this was communicated to all other national trade union centres in the international and European trade union confederations, and urged them to join the international campaign to stop annexation and end apartheid. This is the first time those sort of words have been used in this sort of motion, and I think they're really important. As I said before I read them out, they are words on paper at the moment, but we as trade unionists have a job to ensure that those words are enacted, and that we ensure that we do that work over the coming year and make sure that we do all we can to support the people of Palestine. The trade union movement, as I've said, is based on solidarity, and that solidarity has no borders. When our trade union members return from delegations, they are committed to sharing what they have seen. Many of our members see things that are really upsetting, that really distress them when we take them out on visits. As Layla so eloquently explained before me, she talked very clearly about the situation currently. But when we go, we hear the voices of the Palestinians. And one of the things that they say to us often is that whilst they appreciate us being upset, whilst they appreciate our tears, that isn't what they need. Palestinians don't need us to cry for them. They need our voices. They don't have a voice, and we are their voices when we return. We have a duty to speak out about what we see and to tell the world about the situation that they are living in. And as trade unionists, we will continue to do that. And I'll end with this. Leah Levane said very clearly earlier on, we must always stand with the oppressed and never with the oppressor. That is our commitment as trade unionists, and we will continue with that commitment. Solidarity to everyone here, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Louise, for your contribution and for raising the importance of the role of trade unions in solidarity organizing for Palestinian liberation. I especially really liked your poignant remark on centering the voices of Palestinians and practicing allyship. That was very valuable. Our next speaker is Lindsey German. They are the convener of Stop the War Coalition.
Thanks very much, Yasmin, and thanks for Rob for organising this. And I think it's a very, very important meeting, and everything that we can do for the Palestinians, it's essential that we do, because I think we're in a very critical position at the moment in terms of left-wing politics in Britain on this particular issue. If you look at what has happened to Palestinian rights in terms of the politics of this country, they have now been used as collateral damage. They've been treated as collateral damage by the Labour right in its war on Jeremy Corbyn. And that means, therefore, that the situation which we all welcomed 5 years ago when Jeremy became leader of the Labour Party, and somebody who's got a lifelong commitment to anti-war politics and to Palestinian rights, actually we found it became harder to make the case for Palestinian rights precisely because of this onslaught from the right wing, both the Tory right wing, the media, and of course Labour's right wing as well, who are very, very committed to the whole Zionist project. So I think it's important for us to understand how important this is. It's particularly important that we consider it today when we find that actually there's an escalation that has gone on in the Middle East today with the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, one of the leading nuclear scientists in Iran, who was killed. It's being pretty openly said that he was killed by Mossad, the Israeli secret service, and he was given the green light for this by Donald Trump. So much as I agree with everything that Ben said in the first contribution, I think actually Trump unfortunately hasn't yet left office. And I think we need to be very, very wary about any escalation like this, which is going on, because we have Israel, we have Saudi Arabia allied with the US in terms of confrontation with Iran. And this can lead to a very, very dangerous conflict over the next few weeks. And are we then supposed to say that we're not allowed to criticize what Israel is doing? Are we then supposed to say, if there is a major conflict in the Middle East, that we're not able to discuss these questions at all? That is a complete abrogation of all our responsibility as socialists, as an anti-war movement, as everything else. And Trump has moved the politics around Palestine very, very much to the right in his term of office. The moving of the embassy to Jerusalem, the encouragement of the settlements, the annexation of the West Bank, all of these things that have gone on. Do we seriously think that Biden and Starmer are going to make any changes over these questions? So I think we have to be clear that this isn't just a question of solidarity with the Palestinians. It's also a question about what is happening with geopolitics in the Middle East and the very, very serious situation that we find there. In terms of the witch hunt that has been going on in Labour, many of us said when the IHRA definition was adopted by Labour's NEC, we said this would be the beginning of much, much more of a witch hunt against the left. And actually, we're finding this is more and more the case. And I don't suppose many of us would have perhaps thought that by now Jeremy Corbyn would be suspended from the whip, and for a time was suspended from the party. But there's also other things which I regard as completely unacceptable. I've been reading in recent days the argument that the marvellous demonstration that took place at the Labour conference 2 years ago, when everybody flew Palestinian flags, there were hundreds of flags flying in the conference hall, this made Jewish people uncomfortable. This argument is being put, you can't show solidarity with the Palestinians because this will make other people, it will make Jewish people in particular and other people who don't support the Palestinians uncomfortable. This is an unacceptable argument, just as the argument that is now going on that anybody who supports Jeremy Corbyn, also this can lead to anti-Semitism because it makes Jewish people feel uncomfortable. It's not true. And it's an insult, I think, to Jewish people overall to really talk in these kind of terms, because it suggests that every Jewish person is opposed to Jeremy Corbyn. Now, we know, not just from Leah, who's spoken, other Jewish speakers on the platform tonight, but we know that many, many Jewish people do not agree with what Israel is doing, are in full solidarity with the Palestinians. And this is an argument we have to keep making. You can oppose anti-Semitism, as all of us should do, and you can recognise that anti-Semitism exists in the Labour Party, although I agree very much with Jeremy Corbyn that it has been exaggerated, the extent of the anti-Semitism. But as he says, one anti-Semite is one anti-Semite too many. So you can recognise that and you can fight against anti-Semitism. At the same time, you have to show solidarity with the Palestinians. And these two things are different issues, and we shouldn't confuse these issues. And it's quite possible to show solidarity with the Palestinians at the same time as being an implacable opponent of anti-Semitism. We have to be able to do that. Final point I'd like to make is this. What is happening now inside Labour, and not just inside Labour, but backed up by the BBC, by the media, by the Tories, whose record on racism really doesn't bear any examination. When you look at what they're doing, this is a witch hunt. There is only one way to defeat a witch hunt, which is that you have to stand up against it. You have to stand up and be counted. You have to say you are not going to be silenced by what they're trying to do. You have to say you are prepared to fight over these issues. And this is the thing that we have to commit ourselves to tonight. I hope that everybody will support the PSC activity over the weekend in solidarity with the Palestinians, but I hope also that we will support the people both in and outside the Labour Party who are opposing the witch hunt and are doing their best to stand up against it. They deserve our solidarity. If we do not do it, we will get the IHRA definition forced on all sorts of other organisations, and it is a definition which is very, very controversial in every sense. So we have to stand up against the witch hunt. We have to stand up and be counted, and we have to say that Palestine solidarity remains a central issue for those of us on the left and for those of us in the solidarity and in the anti-war movements.
Thank you so much, Lindsey. and especially thank you for your attention to the complexity and the nuance of the regional context around Palestine, and your affirmation of the very simple truth that anti-Zionism is not the same as anti-Semitism. We will now hear from Daniel Kebede, who is the Senior Vice President of the National Education Union, who is also speaking in their personal capacity.
Thank you very much, Yasmin, and thank you very much, Rob, for organising this very important meeting. I just want to pick up a little bit on where Louise left off. I'm very proud of my union's support for the Palestinian struggle, and very thankful that we do send those 2 delegations a year. In fact, I've been on one, and it was led by Louise, and it really is a delegation, a trip that will stay with me for life, because from that moment you land at Tel Aviv airport, you just get that small insight into what life is like for Palestinians in the occupied territories. You get that insight as to the direction of travel for the Israeli state, because of course in our delegation it was the non-white people who were held up in that airport. For me it was only an hour or so, but for my colleague who was of Palestinian heritage it was several hours. Now, we spent 5 days in the occupied Palestine, in the West Bank, where we was met with such hospitality, such kindness by people who live under the most brutal oppression. Now, I'm a teacher. We spent much time with other teachers, and life is incredibly difficult for Palestinian teachers. When we arrived, they were 8 months without a salary. They can be stopped at checkpoints without explanation and unable to make it to school. In Jerusalem, the textbooks they're using are censored. There are staff shortages, and schools as well as homes have been demolished. But the life of the Palestinian child is also marked by incredible cruelty. We attended a school in Hebron, and as we got closer to the school, the walk became utterly intimidating. Soldiers from the IDF lining the pathways with machine guns. In fact, the soldiers looked little more than children themselves. Moments earlier, they'd gone into the school that we were visiting and demanded it be closed so that they could show settlers around the area. Now, the teachers resisted, but the IDF still got someone on the roof. And I couldn't imagine how frightening that was for the children. The children, of course, are completely innocent. And that's not only how children suffer. They're stopped at checkpoints and denied access to education. But what's more is that hundreds of children every year as young as 12 are in prison. 60% of them arrested in the home, often as they sleep at night. They're taken from their parents. We were hearing reports of children who are blindfolded, hand-tied in transfer from arrest to an interrogation centre, ordered to sit on a metal floor of a vehicle where they were subjected to physical and verbal assault. We were hearing reports of children being put in solitary confinement for up to 2 weeks, something that can only be described as torture. When they stand trial, this is often in a military court. There's no right of representation. The trials take place in Hebrew and not Arabic, and the most common crime is stone throwing. The experience of a settler child throwing stones is completely different to that of a Palestinian child. So we have to be absolutely clear that the struggle for Palestinian rights, for freedom, is an anti-racist struggle. And we have a great tradition of organising against racism, from Cable Street to the movement against apartheid in South Africa up until now. In my home in the Northeast, we have seen off the far right multiple times. National Action, the EDL, the NF, the BNP, they all came here and they were defeated. And it's that movement, black and white, Muslim people, Jewish people, people of all religions and none, that we need now more than ever. That solidarity. because racism is on the rise across Europe and the world. Trump may have been defeated, but the ideas and conditions that led to him still exist. And we see the racism that is being pushed by the leaders of the world, Macron, Johnson, Bolsonaro, and Netanyahu. And it will get worse as those in power look to scapegoat their way out of a global pandemic. So we need to continue the fight against racism, against Islamophobia, against anti-Semitism with the vigor of the struggles that went before us. Stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter against the oppression of the Rohingya, against Chinese oppression of the Muslim population in Xinjiang, and without doubt stand in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, because their struggle is a fight against racism. It is an anti-racist struggle. They are occupied, they are brutalized, and they are killed because they are viewed as inferior, because they are Palestinian. So don't be quiet. Stand together and organize. It's only through that collective solidarity that we can turn the tide. So take part in the day of action tomorrow. The Palestinians need our solidarity now more than ever. Thank you very much, Yasmin.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you for your reflections on the reality of schools teaching in childhood in Palestine. It forces us to reckon with our privileges here in the UK, and that we should not believe that the violence Palestinians are subjected to is static. We are seeing it encroaching on our society, and of course, that violence has been brutalizing the bodies and minds of racialized and diaspora communities here in the UK for decades. So it's definitely also not something new. Next up, we have Rob Ferguson from Free Speech on Israel.
Thank you, Yasmin. I think we're at a decisive political moment for Palestine, for the fight against racism, and for the left. It's important to go to the heart of the question. Jeremy Corbyn was suspended, had the whip withdrawn, and now faces demands for an unequivocal apology for stating a simple truth. But we need to be clear about the general political nature of the attack, which extend beyond Labour. First, the aim is to delegitimise criticism of Israel and frame this as anti-Semitism. In particular, to delegitimise the right of Palestinians or anyone to identify the roots of Palestinian dispossession and oppression in the very character of Israel and the Zionist project itself. It is right to mount a defence of Jeremy on the grounds of democracy and the denial of natural justice. However, we have to firmly refute any conflation between criticism of Israel or anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism has existed not least amongst Jews ever since Zionism emerged as a modern political ideology. It is not anti-Semitic to refer to the state of Israel as a racist or apartheid state, or to campaign for boycott, disinvestment and sanctions. There have been expressions of confused politics, examples of language that evoke anti-Jewish stereotypes, conspiracism, even outright anti-Semitism. These have to be challenged and, if necessary, sanctioned, whenever, wherever they may arise. However, they almost always rest on a conflation themselves between Jews and Israel and Zionism. We have a responsibility to call out the motivation behind these attacks and to openly defend anyone unjustly accused. It is an utter disgrace that to do so now is in itself to risk the label of anti-Semite. It's referred to as denialism. This is the tactic of the witch hunt. To deny the charge is proof of your guilt. The only choice is to confess. Labour's General Secretary has ruled any expressions of solidarity with Jeremy Corbyn as out of order. There are two features, I think, of the EHRC report here that are central. A conflation between Jewish ethnicity and identification with the State of Israel and Zionism. Second, to suggest that complaints of anti-Semitism are smears, constitutes in itself unlawful harassment. And these premises should be refuted. Our movement is at its strongest when we unite against oppression. in all its forms, across our own political differences. Tonight we have speakers who are Labour Party members, members of other organisations or no affiliation. I'm a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. In our audience of hundreds tonight, we no doubt span a huge spectrum. That is as it should be. It's our strength. But we must also discuss how best we can oppose the common threat and defend a common cause. My worry is that the structure of the Labour Party, the imperative of unity, the pressure to abide by the constraints imposed by the party machine, or else jeopardise one's membership, can lead to concession or retreat from principled positions I think the left must assert. Our first responsibility must be to speak out, but also to remember where our strength lies. Salma has spoke of the great anti-war movement and its lasting impact. It is no accident that Jeremy played a leading role in that movement, nor incidental to the determination of his opponents to destroy what he stands for. This meeting has been called in defence of and in solidarity with Palestine and in defence of the left. I hope we can go on to explore further initiatives. That title is not just a phrase. It is to defend the struggles here and now, but also the hard fought for gains of so many who have fought before us, often at a dreadful cost. When I see the support for Trump in the US, despite his defeat, the rise of the far right, of white supremacists, and of fascist organizations who increasingly wield the ideological sword of anti-Semitism, I grit my teeth. Anti-Semitism does not flow from a socialist view of capitalism or of being anti-war or anti-imperialist. It only serves to undermine the unity of the oppressed and the struggle for a society free of exploitation and suffering. The conflation of anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel has given the real forces of anti-Semitism a get-out-of-jail-free card. Trump is now labeling Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and Oxfam as anti-Semitic for criticizing Israel. Be it the Black Lives Matter movement, Ilhan Omar in the States and the Squad have come under attack, as have Muslim communities. 2 days ago, I mourned the 20th anniversary of my mother's death. Her sister and other family members died in the Hungarian Holocaust. I don't claim to speak on behalf of all Jews. My family included Zionist and anti-Zionist, conservative, socialist, communist, religious observers, and atheist. It made no difference at the gates of Auschwitz. They only asked whether one's grandparent was a Jew. So when we are told to still our voices in the interests of unity, we should stand on long-standing socialist principles of our movement. But above all, in the midst of what can seem to be unrelenting attacks, we must remember that in the face of pandemic, austerity, racism, and climate change, our movements and struggles can reach millions that the neoliberal politician, the TV anchor, and the proponent of war and austerity cannot do. And in doing so, we can hold out a vision of a different society, free of oppression, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, in which a free Palestine has its place.
Thank you so much, Rob, for such a poignant contribution. And thank you for all the effort you've put into organizing this event. I just wanted to make one last reminder for anyone who has joined later than these announcements were made earlier, that Palestine Solidarity Campaign are holding a day of action for Palestine tomorrow and an online rally for the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people on Sunday from 5 to 7 p.m. All the details will be linked in the comments. And for any students watching, please add your name to over 400 students in the UK that have signed a statement that expresses their concern about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and its illustrative examples. Last but in no way least, I am pleased to announce our final speaker, Ronnie Kasrils, a former freedom fighter and ANC minister.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. It's a privilege to have been invited. Thanks so much to the organisers, and I'm very inspired by all the powerful speeches we've already heard. Let me start by talking about this group of South Africans who had lived in Britain in exile during the 60s, 70s, 80s, before we came home, served under Mandela in his first government. And when we heard about the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn, we were absolutely outraged. And we felt that those of us who had known him, who had experienced the stand he took in terms of anti-apartheid struggle and support of our liberation for all those years, that it was our duty to come together, as I say, those two dozen who had lived in Britain for some time, and we issued a statement. Within no time, over 2,000 people endorsed that statement with us, so strong was the feeling. And I was asked in the South African media why we were taking that stand. And I explained it was very simple. In the first place, we felt it as our duty because of the solidarity we'd experienced by Jeremy, representing the vast forces of anti-apartheid in Britain, which had helped to bring about the end of apartheid in South Africa. But that also, solidarity happens to be a two-way street. That solidarity for justice, solidarity for the freedom of people who suffer oppression is a two-way street. And it was incumbent on us to join with the British comrades in support of Jeremy, with a broad-based British left that you're all representing tonight. And as I say, we were honoured to be part of this and to have at least made some mark in terms of what is something that is so vital in this very dangerous world we live in today, to continue unabated. Because without such solidarity, we're all targeted, we will all suffer, we will all go down, and with it, the flame of inspiration for younger generations will be in danger of being extinguished. And of course, we come to the fact that to stand for freedom of expression, freedom to stand by oppressed people throughout the world and by the Palestinian people is intrinsic to our own freedom. Be it our struggles within South Africa for full liberation, be it the struggles for you people in Britain for a better Britain and a better world. And in relation to our experience of racism, class and colour exploitation that was apartheid South Africa, we see the same thing in Israel itself. And of course, it's very important to be reminded of a United Nations Resolution 1972, endorsed by the Rome Institute in 2002, of what defines an apartheid state, because it's not just South Africa. And that definition talks about the crime of apartheid being inhumane acts committed for the purpose of maintaining domination by one racial group over another and systematically oppressing them. We've heard so much and we know so much about Israel's suppression of the Palestinian people from 1948, actually even before, the genocide, the war that's waged against them, the ethnic cleansing. And no less a person, and his name has been mentioned already tonight, Nelson Mandela, who knew very well and understood that definition of apartheid, went on to famously state, after we had become liberated in South Africa from apartheid, that that we South Africans cannot feel free until the Palestinian people are free. And indeed, many of us who have traveled to Palestine, traveled from South Africa, so many, from Archbishop Tutu, former President Kgalema Motlanthe, and many, many others, we all have come away shaking our heads. And we've all said the same thing, that the Palestinians suffer far more severely than our oppressed people in South Africa did under the system of apartheid here. We also experience, because we stand up as you do, for justice for the Palestinian people. And we also experience the canard that's become a taboo, a latter-day taboo, that if you criticize Israel, that's equated with being anti-Semitic. You're either a self-hating Jew like myself, what a laugh, or you're an absolute anti-Semite of the worst kind, again, what a laugh. Because the people who they aim at, the Jeremy Corbyns of this world, are actually the finest exponents of non-racism, of justice for all, who speak out for the oppressed of all lands and for Jews themselves, and stand with those Jews, very heroic, the Ilan Pathés and others, a minority like the whites in South Africa, who stood with black South Africans and who stand with Palestinian people, showing the myth of the claim that it's all Jews together against the Palestinian people, all whites together against the black peril. And that's why it's so important that Jews amongst all of us, with all people, broad-based and united, stand with the Palestinian people the way Jeremy Corbyn has. And I'd like to say this, when we called out as anti-Semites because we criticize a blatantly criminal regime, Israel, that if we, as we did, criticize Mobutu Seko Seko of the Congo, that wasn't being anti-black, that if we criticize the monarchy of Saudi Arabia, we're not being anti-Muslim. People understand that. But Israel is provided the impunity by Britain, by America, by the United EU, giving them the green light as an exceptional case. That is something that we can never accept. That gives the green light to the most vicious form of ethnic cleansing, of warfare against defenseless men, women, and children, as we see over and over again in the bombings of Gaza, the attacks on the West Bank, and of neighboring Arab states, despite the cravenness of leaders of those countries to come together with Israel in their treachery, because the Arab street stands by the Palestinian people. So let me say this, that Jeremy Corbyn has been victimized by his own party and this new leadership for the effrontery to defend that party and say that the statement that is anti-Semitism is right in that party is an exaggeration. You know, let's look back in history at the way fingers have been pointed at Israel. And I talk about Einstein and Hannah Arendt in 1948 appealing to the Jews of the United States when Menachem Begin visited to raise funds for his ultra-right-wing party. And they warned, and they used the word, this man and his party, he's a fascist, and the party's a fascist. After the Dayu Yassin massacre in 1948, the Israeli agricultural minister, Aharon Sisling, said he was so shaken by the massacre that we have now behaved like Nazis. They used those terms. What the British establishment and the United States leadership and elites in Europe and elsewhere have done in connivance with the state of Israel is to grant impunity for all their crimes and actions. And in so doing, this taboo has been created, has been strengthened and enforced. What would Einstein and Hannah Arendt have to say about that today? The term anti-Semitism has been invested with almost Machiavellian elasticity to entrap and intimidate a whole legion of human beings who stand for humanity, the rights of the Palestinian people, are not anti-Semites, do not want to see the Jews swept into the sea, and which Palestinians actually say that in their numbers. So we know where we stand and where we must stand. And I agree with all the points made here today in terms of the need to understand that this is not just an attack on an individual, on Jeremy Corbyn, but it's an attack on humanity. It's an attack on the broad left for sure, and the left who stand to the fore and in the front line. But it's an attack on humanity, on everyone who must and ought to stand with people who are demanding nothing more than their birthright, their legacy, their land, which has been stolen from them by a colonial project, aided and abetted in the first place, started by Balfour in your country, by Churchill, who said what's good for the Jewish people in the Middle East is good for the British Empire. The mantle passed on to the United States of America, this imperialist power who wants us all to follow its writ. And the answer is in the answer of Jeremy and his manifesto, and the broad left and the red Shelley, and civilization of humanity, understanding what oppression, what injustice is all about, and the answer, comrades. We are many, they are few. Ours is a just cause. The Palestinian people's cause is a just cause. We stand by them, we will not be intimidated. And in this problematic, grueling, difficult era we live in, we yet see the advances that are always made, even in the comeback in Bolivia as an example. And this light shines throughout the world, and we will triumph because we have the spirit of Spartacus, who was referred to, and of the Spanish Republic, and of the Vietnamese people, and of Nelson Mandela, and those who fought apartheid, and of this glorious Palestinian people who refused to submit. And yes, comrades, the best traditions that came out of Britain and Britain's working class that knows and understands what that ruling class in Britain is about and how it's in league and has always been in league as America, the United States has been, with a gendarme for them in the Middle East, and that's Zionist Israel. We will succeed. We will win, along with the Palestinian people who are to the fore, and we owe them our continuing solidarity, our support for the BDS movement, as we stand by Jeremy Corbyn and the British left, as you stood by us in our struggle in South Africa, and we toppled apartheid, and yes, we're still fighting for a better world, along with you all. But we will win. The power of protest, the power of our unity, the power of our just cause. We will succeed as the Palestinian people will succeed. I want to thank you very much for having me with you as part of this great movement, which is not just the movement of the British left, it's the movement of a world international, the world that will ensure justice for all. Shukran, salam alaikum to all our Palestinian comrades and friends. And we stand by Jeremy Corbyn, and we stand by justice for all.
Thank you very much, Ronnie, for such a powerful and clear message. It is such an honor to have you with us here tonight. The South African anti-apartheid movement and its courageous leader, Nelson Mandela, has been an absolute inspiration to the Palestinian struggle, and of course, its tactics live on in the power of the BDS movement. Once again, I would like to thank all the speakers for their time and contributions this evening. I'd also like to thank everyone who put in time and effort to organize this event. A special thank you to you, Rob Ferguson, for all the effort you've put into this. It has been great listening to everyone. And of course, thank you to all of you who have joined and listened in tonight. I hope that what we have heard this evening affirms our solidarity with the Palestinian people and with Palestine in a time when our solidarity is securitized and criminalized. The Palestinian struggle for liberation is an anti-imperial, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist struggle. We must not compromise in our belief for a liberated, free Palestine. Attempts to silence us, to erase Palestinian history will not stop at those who speak up for Palestine. The suspension of Jeremy Corbyn, Prevent, the proposed bailouts for universities that include conditions of rooting out niche activism, the DFE syllabus guidelines, the IHRA definition, they are all one of the same attempt to quell dissent and break down our communities and solidarities. For a better, freer world where all forms and systems of oppression are abolished, we cannot stay silent. With love and rage and solidarity, thank you for tuning in tonight.